I wanted to just make a mental note here about the crippling impact of depression and isolation and the shame that comes with the ways our coping mechanisms or our attachment styles show up, avoidance shows up, and isolation shows up. And one of the things that become really hard to kind of pick up the pieces and deal with is the shame that shows up in one, possibly not being able to talk about depression or talk about its impact on you personally. And also secondarily, the way that you may do things out of character or even your own desire to be in connection, you may show up because you're experiencing depression and experiencing such a low or grief or loss or, there's so many ways that it's an intersection of things that may silence you and keep you in a shame spiral, right? Like as the work of Brene Brown talks about, and so many others out there addressing both not only shame and resilience, but also addressing depression and mental wellness, and also what it's like to recover from abuse and gaslighting. And so I think there's a really powerful teaching here with this, because in the recovery, we have to be willing to recognize that our behavior, despite where we felt we may be at, and despite the challenges of being there, or in addition to, maybe that would be the better way of saying that, in addition to, there is still harm that's enacted and trust that comes under question when we're unable to be clear about that the isolation is happening or the siloing is happening for you, and you don't know yet that that's what's happening. But when you have to come back to clean up some of that stuff, unless you understand what was happening, then you're not able to do the repair and the relationship. And that's something that's important. And I'm also realizing for myself that in these past couple of years, where I think I've been in the darkest and the deepest depression in my life, and also having all these life events simultaneously happening like a big ball of like clusterfucks, that I also have, pulled away from relationships. I've also pulled away from connection, because when you're depressed, you really don't have the energy for it. You really don't have, there's so many things that happen in the body, the mind, and the psyche. And so in recognizing that doesn't take away from the impact that it has on the relationships around you, and the hurt that can come out of that. And it will be challenging when you go back and you're out of that particular cloud and that particular like fog of the depression. When you're out of it, it can be challenging to engage in the repair work in the relationships in a sustainable and generative way, because you don't realize that those actions actually caused harm or actually had an impact that is maybe not what you had hoped for and or anticipated for. And so I think that unless you understand that, it'll be hard to repair relationships, because in that repair, there's also the acknowledging that I wasn't available, and that what you may have your stories in your life that are consistent themes, right? And so I didn't realize or don't realize the impact of that, and I want to jump right back into relationship, but don't actually create the conversation and the space for the words, I am so sorry that my behavior impacted you negatively and or called in question our relationship, right? Like we have to be able to say that, and we have to be able to say, I'm sorry that you were hurting, and that hurt. And if you allow me the opportunity, I'd love to like work at, reestablishing our relationship, recognizing that it's going to take time to rebuild that trust. But at least we're giving the people around us and the people that we love the acknowledgement necessary to say that when you were in your place of deep depression, when you released yourself, that you can also recognize that it had an impact, right? And that in that impact, feelings were either hurt or feelings were had and not acknowledged. And while you may be glad that you're coming back, I call it coming back online, because it's like you're asleep and then everything starts to come, you start waking up, so to speak. And when that happens, there can be so much shame around realizing that all these things had occurred under your watch and that you were not fully yourself, at least in the way you want to be and in alignment. It's also it's repairing these themes of trust challenges that we have with each other. It's also repairing the amount of questions and the amount of because sometimes things are happening, you're wondering what's happening, and then you tend to think, or you may think, you may think that it was you, right? But it's actually not you. The person's having an experience in their own lives and they're unaware, and because they're unaware, it becomes a much more, I'm going to use the word reckless, but I don't think reckless is the word to suffice. But, a person's not engaging in that and is not thinking about that. And because you're not thinking about that or engaging in that, then you don't realize the impact it has. So having said that, I think it's an important aspect to think about for us if you experience mental health issues, or if you're in a loop yourself and dealing with some old shit and some old trauma that has, it's camouflaged, it's changed face, it looks different. For example, a way that can be is that, when you're a kid, your coping mechanism looked this way. Now that you're an adult, it's an acceptable coping mechanism. So you're a workaholic, right? Not so much because you love your work, but because you rather be busy with your work than any other thing. So it's just a substitute. And when that happens, we don't become aware because it's changed face. And we don't realize that your workaholism is actually an avoidance style, right? This is where we talk about trauma becoming personality. And when you think you know a person and their personality, actually it's not. They're a bunch of coping mechanisms from the enormous amount of trauma they experienced. And so being able to be with each other and transform that, those moments, rather than just immediately like, oh, we're going to jump back into the relationship and we're not going to acknowledge what has happened between us. We're not going to acknowledge the way that has caused pain and has caused, a change in the dynamic of the relationship. And that's really an important component to moving forward in anything, is the capacity and the ability to be able to make amends and say, I was struggling, it was hard, and yes, the impact of that to the people in your life or the relationships in your life was devastating and rough. And that if we can allow each other the opportunity to start fresh, and to work and to reassure each other when we need reassurance, because it can get scary. So I just wanted to kind of name this. This is a big topic. It's a big thing. It has a lot of depth. But even for me in relationship to this and recognizing this in my own life, and also the feeling of coming back online and like coming out of the fog of all the grief and the pain, the trauma, the devastation, the triggering, all the things that these couple of years have had, I would be remiss not to say that one of the first steps is like acknowledging and accepting that that can also impact other people, right? And this is not that line of like stepping into people pleasing or thinking about the impact on others more than you're thinking about your own relationship to yourself. And one of the first places is coming to like the recognition of your grief and your depression and how that can impact your relationships. Like that's the first step, just as a personal and individual person, saying to myself, I need to be able to acknowledge the impact that the depression had on me and therefore impacting the people around me, my perspective, my way of moving, my confidence, my self-esteem. And these are things we know and we talk a lot about. And I think it's also important that when you're like recovering yourself from that space, that you can also be an acknowledgement of those things. And then for me, the second step is to say, all right, I'm going to acknowledge with compassion that I've been in a place and I've needed to learn to tend to myself in that place, which it can be a place of neglect if you don't have a relationship with your own mental health. And that in that, the next thing that winds up happening is that when you're in relationship to that for yourself, rather than trying to deny and just call it was a bad no, it was serious, it was sinking. And it changes how you see, right? In all the ways. I mean, literally, figuratively, emotionally, mentally. And that with that, we have to be honest about the impact of it. And when you start realizing that, being able to go back around and say, hey, I was less than myself. And that doesn't change, that I need to be with myself and like know how to support myself and help myself and build my support system. But secondarily to that, I also want to acknowledge the way that impacted you, whether this is your relationship with your romantic partner, your friendships, your community, being able to name that. And then third is being able to say, we know we're going to have to work at this and that things are not going to be perfect, but we can move forward with a lens that has an awareness. And rather than only thinking that our depression and our experiences only affect us as an individual, because you're the one in the shit pot, the truth is that it does impact the people around you in such a different way. And so I want to say this to encourage the fact that we do need to make amends. We do need to be able to be accountable and responsible for how we're showing up in the world, even when we're not at our best. And also to, as a radical act of healing, a radical act of community, collective change, is to also say that to the relationships that are valuable to us and important to us, what we're going to do, is that we're going to take the time to actually do the restorative work and the restorative conversations and not bypass them because you actually don't know what to do or how to feel, or you actually do. You're feeling shame about the fact that you were not able to sustain your relationships, or that you weren't able to stand into that courageous act of saying, I'm not okay, right? And so this is just these opportunities. Really, they're opportunities if we want them, right? And I say that a lot lately because you could not be ready. You could not want to grow from that place. You could not want to not want to in that way that like, oh, you don't want it, but you think that particular path is not for you, so you'll stay stuck in what you know because it's what you know, it's what's familiar. And even if it's shitty, the familiarity has breeded comfort, which happens, right? And so even for myself, my own personal struggle around some of this is really like how it can be sad or disturbing sometimes, how comfortable we can get with the dysfunction, how comfortable we can get with the smallness, how comfortable we can get with the stories and the narratives and the shit deposited in order to survive the moment. only to realize later on at some point that it was really shitty, not comfortable at all, and it was a form of self-violence. So this is part of that, like, you can choose whether or not you want change, or even because we talk a lot about energetic resonance, and we talk a lot about the quality of energy, intending, or what some people call spiritual hygiene, of the like. But some of that still can allow for some bullshit to happen, and for some bullshit line to be created around a way that this particular thing that you do is actually going to keep you protected, or keep you, for example, if isolation or avoidance and running is a tendency of yours as well, what'll tend to happen is that you can come up with really good language around why you still need to isolate, around why you may still need to have these boundaries. You call them boundaries, and you may call them spiritual hygiene, but what they are is they're your coping mechanism, and your pattern camouflaged. It has a mask on. You just made it sound much more fancier with some really well articulated bullshit. And at the end of the day, it's still reinforcing the pattern, but from a much more, like undercover and camouflaged way. So we have to be able to ask the questions. I have to be able to ask myself the questions like, is this really what I believe and truly what I mean? Or is this my tiredness talking? Is this my depression speaking? Which sounds sometimes a little like much, but it's not, because if you're able to realize the impact that things are having on you and the way you cope with them, then you're really able to create support systems that won't necessarily allow you to slip and slide through with your bullshit, right? Or your bullshit saying, and fall back into the pattern, or fall back into the grip, right? So I think that being able to kind of sit with some of these pieces, to me, is powerful and life transforming. Having said that, there's still like vulnerability hangovers that happen, because you know that you just really, so much of you was seen, and they're really tender places because you're afraid of abandonment as well. And so, if you isolate or pull away or avoid, part of that is really you trying to anticipate this experience that you've already had in life, that people leave you when you're really complicated, or that people run or abandon you when it feels like you're too much. And so you create these mechanisms that do that automatically, so that you don't have to have those experiences again. Again, being able to name this and being able to talk about it is the place of transformation, because then I can say, if I don't want the same things to happen over, and I actually want different results, then this time I'm going to be much more conscious that I'm planting an apple seed and not an orange seed, right? That I can tend to the land that'll nourish an apple tree growing versus a citrus fruit. That those nuances, those distinctions, we can only meet ourselves and support ourselves and the real pieces of ourselves, right? If we can be honest with ourselves. But if you got to keep on, because there's some good stories, and if it's not for the people that love me stepping in sometimes and being like, what the fuck is that story? Where did that come? This recent experience, right? I said something, and my friend reflecting back to me is like, what the fuck was that? And I was like, wait, what? And just really taking the moment to be like, wait, that actually doesn't make sense. And to be able to be like, shit, for myself, and be like, right, it is, oh, fuck, right? And that's exactly how that happened. Like, I thought about it, then I'm always thinking, where's something, where's the origin, where's the root coming from? And I was like, oh, fuck, it is a story. It is a story. Another fucking story. I feel like it's like catching, if you will, like ladybugs. You see this little flicker of something going on, and you go to investigate it, and you discover that is some of your bullshit showing up. And your bullshit are the places where you have almost like having the wound, and then it's what type of Band-Aid did you put on it so that it's not bleeding on your clothes, but yet it's still being absorbed by the Band-Aid, right? And you can have put a little Band-Aid, too little, too big. Your bullshit is the Band-Aid. Because really what the wound needs is it needs cleaning out. It probably needs some help with some salves or some sort of, what's that thing, that Neosporin type shit to help begin healing. Or you recognize that the wound is much more bigger and you actually need stitches and that putting a Band-Aid doesn't work. Now, having said that, this Band-Aid metaphor, I'm really going in with it, but the Band-Aid is your bullshit. It's the story. It's the way we try to cover up the pain, either because we don't want to experience it again or we don't know what to do with it. But in this particular conversation, what I'm really, really wanting to step into, really wanting to dive into, is the fact that we'll have all these bullshit Band-Aids, these stories and these narratives. And when you discover them, I think it's an important part of being able to deconstruct the shame and deconstruct the way that this may also add humiliation to shame, that causes us not to really think about the impact of it. Not really think about how this thing can be, can isolate people that you care about, can wipe you out, and actually it steals from you, it takes from you. Because your bullshit is only reinforcing the original lie, almost like the original sin, right? That you're not worth loving or you're too much to love and you're going to be abandoned. And so that's why we have to look at these stories of origin in order to be able to meet those aspects of ourselves that's stuck there. And, I think Jung's work is really good about this, right? Where it uses a lot of archetypes in order to trying to bypass the alarm system that was created as a result of your trauma. There's all these archetypes and metaphors that are used and mythologies that are used in order to get into the core of your being and deliver these messages. And so being able to acknowledge oh shit, and Dr. Pincola, Clarissa Pincola Estes, in Women Who Runs with the Wolves, she's a Jungian analyst as well. And a lot of her work does the same thing. It talks about these pieces and aspects of yourself that may have had to go, offline and hide. And that when you're moving through pieces, it's going to be so important, rather than to do the bullshit, but to actually let the people you love know that you can see the ways in which these things have impacted the people you love and also impacted you and the quality of relationships you want in your life. And when you can do those, this is how we can heal each other. Because when we begin to go, oh wait, I think I have abandoned, it's my bullshit, I actually want to come back and say, I am sorry for the way that this has impacted you. And I am sorry for, and if you can be more specific, I'm sorry that this felt like abandonment. I'm sorry this felt like you weren't doing something enough, right? And that wasn't the case. And that we can also take responsibility. I wasn't okay. And in my not okayness, I also chose to isolate. I also chose to distance myself. And that's part of the cleanup in terms of really tending to your life and moving toward a time and a space where, rather than being swallowed by shame, or rather than resulting to old patterns because of old fears, you actually get to say to yourself and to the people you love, I want to do differently. I love you enough that I want to do differently. So, anyway, that's what I have. This is just a small teaching that was just, I've been in it myself, and also coming to my own realizations for my own seasons of life. And that the reason why I do the work that I do is because I recognize in so many ways that so many of us are going through it, having experiences, and we don't know excuse me, we don't know how to clean or how to wrap, like when we don't know how, it impacts everything else. And either way, we're still going to need to, if we care about the things, then we're going to need to come back and circle back to have the conversation. So, I hope that this small teaching and small chat was nourishing for you. And I think one of the things I want to say to close it, because this is what I was trying to get to anyway, as well, is that it's not going to feel great. It's not. It's not going to feel like your most brightest, shiny moment, your grandest potential. It's going to be hard. And shame is going to show up. And there's still an opportunity to choose differently for your sake and also the people around you that love you. So, having said that, I leave you with this as we continue to work the work, as it continues to be a practice. And I'm grateful for you. And I'm grateful that we have the honor of walking this life together. So, I'll catch you later. This is GoddIncense. I hope you enjoyed this small teaching. And I'll talk to you soon again next time.